Hey everyone. Carthage was the preeminent Western Mediterranean power in the 3rd century BC, but by the end of that century, they had lost two decisive wars to the Roman Republic, the First Punic War and the famous Second Punic War. Today, I really want to talk about the Third Punic War and why it's important. This video is a little bit different. It's much more long form, which I personally enjoy making a lot more, so let me know what you guys think. So Carthage and Rome, why were they fighting all the time? And it's a whole bunch of different reasons and routes you can go with this. At the end of the day, there's this somewhat prescient trap. It's called the Thucydides trap, which says that rising powers and stagnating or falling powers will typically come into conflict over the course of their rise and their subsequent fall. And this is famous during the Peloponnesian War, where you had a rising Athenian power and a stagnating, if not decaying, Spartan power. In that situation, the Spartans obviously end up winning the Peloponnesian War. But with the Punic Wars, you have a rising Roman Republic that had consolidated their control over Italy, and you had a Carthaginian Republic that was, maybe oligarchy is a better word, that had colonies throughout Sicily and the Western Mediterranean, and they came into conflict in Sicily. And that kind of kicks off the First Punic War. And Carthage and Rome had been friendly up until then. But as Rome grew and Carthage got a little concerned, things quickly fell apart. I really like to think about the First and Second Punic Wars as like Godzilla versus King Kong, just battling it out in downtown Tokyo. These were generational conflicts where fathers and sons and grandsons all fought one another throughout the course of two wars, massive wars. Some of the most spectacular battles, some of the most iconic moments in ancient history, like Hannibal crossing the Alps, they all occurred during these first two wars, the First and Second Punic War. But like I mentioned earlier, there's three of them. So why don't we talk about the Third Punic War? And that's what I want to cover again in this video, because I think the narrative with the Punic Wars goes like this. First war, it's mostly a naval war. It's fought on Sicily. This is the original King Kong versus Godzilla. Not a whole lot of fighting in Italy. Lots of naval battles. Rome wins. Carthage loses. This is like the famous Terminator 2 sequel. It's the Second Punic War. This is the truly epic war. You have Hannibal Barca, Scipio Africanus, Hannibal crossing the Alps, invading Italy, wiping out multiple Roman armies in some of the most iconic battles of the ancient world. And then you have the Roman general Scipio Africanus, who's not quite Africanus yet, kind of rising through the ranks over the course of this war. And then you have the climactic end-all be-all battle outside of Carthage in Africa, the Battle of Zama, and Scipio wins. And then with the third one, it's not so much King Kong versus Godzilla. I think historically it's portrayed as King Kong versus the Geico Gecko. And you have Carthage getting sacked, its civilization lost forever. Like, why doesn't anyone talk about that? I think in general, it's almost become like an end note in history. The first two Punic Wars, epic, awesome. The third one, oh yeah, Rome just sacked it. I don't like this narrative. I really enjoy learning about the Third Punic War because it highlights how powerful the Carthaginian state was even after two catastrophic defeats against the Roman Republic. I mean, if we take a look at the lengths of the wars, the First Punic War is over 20 years. The Second Punic War is a hair under 20 years. And then the Third Punic War is 3 years. So it might make it seem like the Third Punic War is kind of this quick, easy thing. But in reality, Rome doesn't suffer any catastrophic defeats against the Carthaginians in the Third Punic War. But the fact that Carthage was able to hold on for 3 years against the Roman Republic, potentially at, if not close, but maybe at the zenith of its power, that's very interesting to me. And it's not like Rome took its time. They were actively unable to take the city of Carthage and some of the surrounding allied cities. And Rome poured immense resources into capturing Carthage, and it still took them years to accomplish their objectives. And that kind of highlights, so what about Carthage makes it unique? Why was Carthage able to stand up to basically Rome just throwing everything at it and last 3 years? And when we dig into Carthage leading into the Third Punic War, we're examining a city 150 years before the birth of Christ, with the population estimated being in the hundreds of thousands. No one really knows how much. I mean, imagine that. That's got to make it one of the most largest cities in the Western Mediterranean. And you have a population who's experiencing civilization genocide and they're holding on. They're desperately fighting tooth and nail, and they're hellbent on preserving their civilization against a coming Roman onslaught. And they had this special city that's so important throughout the history of the Mediterranean, that city being Carthage. And you see the uniqueness of the city allowed itself to be preserved against this Roman onslaught. So I want to talk about this war. I want to talk about some of the context. This isn't going to be perfect. I'm not going to go into all the nitty gritty, but I want to talk about some of the highlights for me and why the Third Punic War is so important. So let me know what you guys think. I hope you enjoy this video. So I think it's important to start off what's been going on in the Carthaginian state between the end of the Second Punic War and the Third Punic War, specifically maybe the 30 years preceding the Third Punic War. I don't want to get into Hannibal and his leadership of Carthage. I want to talk about the Carthaginian state during the lead up to the Third Punic War. So what's going on after the King Kong versus Godzilla round 2 battle at the Zama? What's going on in Carthage? So at the end of the Second Punic War, Carthage is pretty much stripped of its empire. It's forced to abandon Spain. It's forced to abandon a lot of pretty much everything outside Africa. It was forced to pay a massive amount of money to Rome over the 50 years. And this kind of changes the way Carthage views itself. On top of like the financial, military, and territorial loss, Carthage also has to hand over its foreign policy autonomy to Rome. It can't wage any wars outside of Africa, and any wars within Africa, it has to ask Rome for permission. So essentially, Carthage is just forced to become an economic powerhouse, and it does that quickly. You have to remember, Carthage is uniquely situated on a choke point of a couple different trade routes in the Western Mediterranean. And Carthage quickly recovers. It bounces back in terms of its economy. It actually offers to pay Rome off its 50-year payments early. And Rome says no, because Rome's like, well, that's kind of concerning. How do you guys get rich so quickly? But I think this economic prosperity didn't come without its issues, specifically that once Carthage gets wealthy again, I think it begins to resent Rome's strangulation of its political, specifically foreign policy autonomy. And the one issue that highlights this was the Carthaginian relationships with a Numidian king. So let's dive into the Numidians, right? The Numidians are a collection of probably tribes, and they'd be situated inland Africa, directly west of Carthage, and they traditionally have been Carthaginian allies. And when you think of Numidian, just think of incredibly effective mounted warriors, okay? A lot of the battles in the First and especially the Second Punic War essentially came down to Carthaginian cavalry, which was typically Numidians, just dominating the Roman cavalry. And at the Battle of Zama, Scipio Africanus was able to overcome this because he had Numidians of his own. And the Numidian tribes, they were a variety of different tribes. So some of them fought each other, some would ally with Rome, some would ally with Carthage. But historically, up until the end of the Second Punic War, they had been Carthaginian allies. And after the Second Punic War, the major Numidian power player was a king named Massinissa. And Massinissa was ancient at the start of the Third Punic War, and he had spent his career harassing Carthage. He was well aware of the treaties that define Carthage's relationship, waging war within Africa, and he'd really pushed the envelope on the Carthaginians, and he'd constantly lead incursions into their territory. He'd besiege cities, he'd lead raids that would devastate countryland, basically just poking the Carthaginians with a giant sword because he knew they couldn't do anything. And the Carthaginians knew they needed Roman permission, and they would constantly ask Rome to allow them to, either help us mediate with the Numidians so we don't have to constantly get attacked by them, or let us raise an army. And Rome would always side with Massinissa and the Numidians. And it's important to understand, why did Rome always side with him? So he was at the Battle of Zama. That's how old Massinissa is. And because of him helping Rome at that climactic King Kong versus Godzilla battle, he was able to create his own kingdom of Numidia. So he was able to take what was once a essential ally of Carthage and make them almost a peer competitor. And finally, it got to the stage where Carthage was just fed up. They couldn't take it anymore. It was devastating a lot of the countryside because these Numidian warriors, they were almost like shock tactics. They'd siege a city, devastate the surrounding countryside, and they'd withdraw. but the constant incursions really messed with Carthage. So finally they said, F it. We're going to raise an army. We're going to deal with this Massinissa, who, by the way, he's in his like late 80s. He's super old, but he's really, really smart. And he's a great tactician and strategist. So this is, Carthage raises this army. They can't tolerate these Numidian incursions anymore. And they actually get some Numidians on their side. So they raise over 30,000 troops, and it's led by this commander named Hasdrubal. And they wage war in Numidia. And this is a very, very clear violation of Rome's right to let Carthage wage war within Africa. And the Carthaginians were well aware of this. To Carthage, these Numidians were nothing more than ill-prepared tribesmen. They can't fight back against the renewed might of Carthage. Look how wealthy we are. Can they? Well, again, it's really important to understand the Numidians are really, really good at mounted warfare. And when you're fighting in this section of Africa, there's a lot of wide open space. And cavalry is definitely the way to go when you're fighting within two massive armies. And there's this famous military maxim that, strategy, tactics is for amateurs, logistics is for professionals. And this truly is really important during this Numidian Carthaginian war, because the Carthaginian army, they're not supplied that well. So they're constantly trying to fight off the Numidians. They fight off the initial raid, and Massinissa ends up kind of dragging them deeper into Africa. And the Carthaginians want to set peace battle. They know the Romans are watching this. They know the Romans are freaking out. They know this is a clear violation of the treaty, but their mindset's probably something along the lines of, you know what? If we just stomp the Numidians and we, apologize to Rome, Rome might not be able to attack us because it's just going to be a bang, bang, done kind of thing. The issue was the Numidians weren't just going to get beaten back quickly. They have this set piece battle. It's indecisive. The Carthaginians are forced to flee to a fortified hill, and the Numidians starve them out. The Carthaginians end up surrendering. It's very, very embarrassing. But the issue is that there's a Numidian prince who leads an attack when the Carthaginians surrender, and he kills a lot of their forces. So this army gets devastated. And Hasdrubal, who's the Carthaginian commander, he goes back to Carthage. And Carthage at this stage is absolutely freaking out. Not only did they break this treaty, not only did the Numidians wipe out their army, but now Rome has an excuse to wage a war they've been licking their chops to do for a long time. It's a really, really bad spot for the Carthaginians to be in, and they know this. So before we dive into Rome's reaction, I want to talk about what Rome's been up to between that giant King Kong versus Godzilla climactic battle at Zama at the end of the Second Punic War to the beginning of the Third Punic War. So since Zama, Rome has grown exponentially. They have most of eastern Spain. They fought a series of wars against the Macedonians. Remember, that would be the remnants of Alexander's kind of original area where he began his conquest of Persia. And they have that under control, and they're beginning to exert a lot of influence in Greece too. And the Roman Republic's watching the Carthaginian War, and they're kind of saying, this might be the time where we engage them. But Rome was also stretched a little thin. Spain is historically difficult for Rome to conquer. Spain's it's not set piece battles. It's lots of skirmishes and wars of attrition, which is draining Rome a little bit. So they're stretched a bit thin. And Macedonia in general was just waiting for an excuse to light up in rebellion, right? So the territorial conquests also coincided with Rome becoming a much more economic power, a merchant power. And there's this new class of traders, craftsmen, and commercial sailors, and they're beginning to resent how quickly Carthage has taken its place atop the kind of commercial city power players, right? And the Roman Senate, remember, this is not the Roman Empire, this is the Republic. They're split on the issue of Carthage. And they're split between two factions. The first faction is the one that wants to destroy Carthage. And the second one, which I won't really get into, they didn't like Carthage. They weren't allies of Carthage in any sense of the word, but they thought there were bigger fish to fry. But I want to dive into the faction that really wanted to end Carthage. And it's led by, the main player in this faction is called Cato the Elder. And there's a Cato the Younger, who I'll probably talk about later, who is a famous enemy of Julius Caesar. But Cato the Elder is a distant ancestor of him. And Cato the Elder, I like to think about him like the Roman Republic equivalent to Dick Cheney, right? This guy really believed in conservative values for ancient Rome at the time. He famously passes a law that won't allow women to display luxuries in public and things of that nature. And he really believes in using Rome's ability, its unchallenged military, to stomp out any rivals, which isn't that it's not that controversial for the ancient terrain to have that opinion. And Cato was famous, he's probably most famous today, for this desire to burn Carthage to the ground. It might be one of the first times in history you have someone advocating a war just to do a genocide and annihilate someone. And he has this famous saying, leading up to the Third Punic War, he'd end a lot of his speeches with Carthago delenda est, which is a very rough translation of, furthermore, I believe Carthage should be destroyed. So every single speech, doesn't matter if they're debating Latin use of farming, it doesn't matter. He'd end with, furthermore, I think Carthage should be destroyed. Imagine that happening today, like really odd. Talk about a single issue. And Cato's old. He fought in the Second Punic War, he fought in the Macedonian Wars, and he's kind of the main political player in ancient Rome at this time. And he's been advocating for destroying Carthage for a while, but that kicks up 10x when he visits Carthage a couple years before the Third Punic War, and he sees with his own eyes the wealth. He and his allies would point to Carthaginian wealth, saying, look how quickly they rebuilt their economy. One day they can challenge Rome again. And when he does this visit, he's shocked by what he sees, all this wealth. He gives this famous speech. Carthage is about a 3-day journey to Rome. He gives this speech to the Roman Senate, and he's on the floor of the Senate, and he opens up his toga, and a bunch of figs drop down. That was a luxury at the time in the ancient world. Still is today if you like the taste of it. And it was just to demonstrate how wealthy Carthage has gotten. I kind of like to imagine him speaking to the other senators almost in a very paternalistic manner on the floor of the Senate, kind of deriding his yellow-bellied countrymen. Remember the Battle of Cannae? Remember Hannibal crossing the Alps and his horde of Gauls, Italians, and Carthaginians who had us on the ropes? What are we doing here, allowing them to even exist? That was pretty much his argument. And the argument was fairly well received, but there was nothing Carthage had done yet to make Rome go to war with them. They were kind of Rome's little puppy dogs in the sense that, yeah, sure, they're wealthy, but they didn't really challenge us at all. They couldn't bite back. Of course, this ends the Second Carthage wages war within Africa after Rome said don't do it. So that call for war reached a fever pitch within the Roman Republic. And the conversation shifted to, should we conduct this war? To, hey, we're going to have to fight this war, but what do we do with Carthage? Do we just take them over and assimilate and slave, or do we literally just destroy them? That's what the debate came very quickly. This debate raged in Rome during the lead up to the war. But now I want to talk about when this war kicks off, what are the moves made by both sides, right? And as you can imagine now, Carthage is freaking out. There's not really a way they can win this war against Rome. Rome is the top dog in the Mediterranean at this time. And they hope to basically kind of lie on their back, admit they're wrong, give them the puppy dog eyes, and promise they never do it again. And this looked like them essentially sending a couple dozen statesmen to Rome, to the Senate, to beg for mercy. And they even point out that, hey, that commander Hasdrubal, who led our forces, we killed him just because we feel so bad about raising the army. We're so sorry, Rome. We really didn't mean to. We promise we won't do it again. And as they get to Rome, they realize Rome's already preparing for this war. They're already raising legions. They're ready to go. So the old, hey, Rome, we pinky promise not to go to war, it doesn't work. The Senate kind of laughs them off. So the Carthaginians return back to Carthage, and the city of Carthage itself, it's freaking out. They would do anything not to fight this war. And then the Roman army lands in Africa. And the Roman army is led by the current Roman consul. I don't even want to get into the names because there's only going to be one important Roman leader I want to talk about later. But the city of Carthage begins to essentially beg him not to attack. And they're talking to the consuls, and this is not a great sequence of Roman history. It's pretty damning for the Republic because the Carthaginians have zero leverage in this. They know they'll probably lose this war. And the Roman leaders of the army, this is a juicy, juicy assignment. Being the famous Roman who defeats the Carthaginian menace, even though they're in a much more weakened state than they were in the past. So Carthage begins to just throw themselves at the feet of the Roman leaders at this time. And the concessions get pretty outlandish. Carthage offers to destroy their weapons to avoid the war. Rome says, fine. Also, you should probably destroy your armor too. Carthage does it. Rome says, hey, you should destroy the fleet of yours. It's not that large, but you should destroy that too. Just in good faith, Carthage? And Carthage says, fine, whatever, we'll do it, So they burn a lot of their armor. So Carthage destroys all this stuff. And then Rome says, you know what? We actually want you guys to abandon your ancient city of Carthage, move 10 kilometers inland, then we won't mess you guys up. And if this Carthage is just like, oh, okay, we're fighting this war, that's unacceptable. We can't do that. So the Carthaginian statesmen, they go back to Carthage, and you can imagine the city at this stage. I mean, this is just a gut punch of all gut punches. And they lash out. They attack these Carthaginian statesmen who obviously failed to negotiate this deal. And they begin, running through Carthage, looking for anyone who looks, sounds, acts like a Roman/Italian, lynching them in the street. It's a really, really ugly scene of a true city staring at the kind of cliff of just genocide. So Rome begins this siege, and it's really important that Carthage has this incredible seaport, right? So throughout the next 3 years during the siege, Carthage will be continuously supplied, sometimes even better than the Romans themselves. So there's no way Rome is going to take this city by just starving it. It's going to get bloody. What really makes this siege interesting, as we kind of dive into the first stage of the war, there's kind of 3 to 4 stages, is just how quick it is. And when I mean quick, I just mean it's not like this static, almost medieval type of war where you have a garrison army held up in a castle and then the besieging army just sitting around the actual castle itself. For this war, this is a very fluid conflict. And it's not just a mop-up war, right? The Romans are trying 3 to 4 different strategies over the course of 3 years, and it's a testament to the Carthaginian forces who opposed Rome that this war was so strenuous. And the first Roman strategy is pretty basic. Land an army in Africa, besiege the city, take the city. A lot easier said than done. The only issue is they didn't take the city. Even though the Carthaginians had just burned a lot of their arms and armor in a giant fire, the Romans try to scale the walls and immediately fail after bitter fighting. They try again, and they fail both times. So the Romans decide to set up 2 camps and try to just siege the Carthaginians out. That doesn't go well. Through a mixture of poor planning, really innovative Carthaginian tactics and raids, and Roman leadership, quite frankly, getting in their own way, the Romans fail to have a strategic breakthrough that could end the siege. This isn't a siege in the sense that we're thinking of it, again, like medieval. The Carthaginians and the Romans are constantly fighting, hand-to-hand combat outside the city walls themselves. This is a very fast-paced, fluid environment. And I'm overgeneralizing this on purpose. I can spend all day talking about ancient warfare, but it's really important to note that how fluid this was. This isn't your typical kind of medieval siege. There is a lot of small group battles and minor set-piece battles being fought surrounding the siege itself. So Rome's original strategy fails, so they decide to switch things up. New Roman leaders come in, and the second strategy is a lot more of a looser siege, more of a naval blockade than anything else. And Rome spends the rest of that year besieging Carthaginian allies on Africa. This has mixed results. They take one city, they take another city, but they can't take certain cities, and it's just kind of drains the war effort. The mixed results, they're not good. There's a famous military maxim that war is politics by other means. And what that means is that the Prussian writer who wrote at the time, war is just like politics. Optics really, really matter. You need to have momentum, and you need to have perception, which is key. So Rome, in the second stage of this war, they don't really have a whole lot to kind of put their feather in their cap on it, so to speak. They're really struggling with gaining momentum, and everyone in the Mediterranean is watching this. Rome's relatively new to being the most recent hegemon in the Mediterranean, and everyone's understanding that this isn't the cakewalk they thought it would be. Carthaginian itself, their civilian leadership is overthrown by Hannibal's grandson, who unfortunately is also called Hasdrubal. And in Macedonia, there's a rebellion that kicks up. They end up destroying a Roman army. So this war is really turning bad for Rome. Again, Rome is that new hegemon. Everyone's kind of just waiting around the dinner table with their knives and forks, looking for a moment of weakness so they can trounce on them. So Rome makes a change in their leadership for the third and final time in the war. They, through a mixture of political maneuvering and, kind of overlooking some constitutional requirements, elect a guy named Scipio. Yes, similar to the name of the famous Scipio Africanus. He's a relative of sorts through adoption. He becomes the new leader of these forces, and that's kind of why Rome ends up winning this war. Scipio, he's a very capable commander, and he's kind of been on the sidelines of this conflict the entire time. He's at the famous battle where the Numidians beat the Carthaginians, he's actually observing that battle on behalf of the Roman Republic. And he's been fighting throughout this war, and he's just shown a lot of competence, a lot of bravery, and oh yeah, his last name's Scipio. So Scipio's always been in Africa. It's this famous Roman trope throughout the Republic. So this enters the third stage of the war. Rome gets itself sorted out, a lot more decisive leadership. And if you think about it, you've got Scipio Aemilianus fighting Hannibal's grandson. So it's fascinating. It's almost like the third iteration now of like a Scipio fighting a Barca, which is super interesting in my opinion. So Scipio attempts to cut off Carthage from the sea by building these really extensive siege works that would cut off their port from the sea. The Carthaginians, during the past 2 years, they've been rebuilding their navy within the port. It's not a large navy, but it's effective. So in an act of kind of tactical and strategic desperation, the Carthaginians try to break the siege through attacking the Roman navy. And Hannibal's grandson, he's leading this numerically inferior fleet against the Roman fleet. And he wins a tactical, if fleeting, victory. The issue was that the Carthaginians couldn't overextend themselves and try to outright destroy the Roman navy. The Roman navy just had to hang on because they have numerical superiority. Remember, this is ancient warfare. There's lots of ramming. There's lots of ships basically tying themselves to one another and fighting a land war at sea. So the Carthaginians, they're smart to quit when they were ahead and return to the port to keep the Romans out. But the Carthaginian ships, while they destroyed a lot of Roman ships, they took a lot of casualties themselves. Casualties they won't really be able to replace. So it's a small tactical victory for Carthage, but it's not the victory they were looking for. So Scipio also ends up destroying a main Carthaginian army near one of their military camps, not too far from Carthage itself. So at this point, it's really just a matter of time before Carthage gets penetrated by the Roman forces and the city falls. So Scipio, while he's trying to cut off the Carthaginian port, he's building these massive, massive siege works. One of these is a wall that's higher than the walls of Carthage, and it allows archers to shoot down projectiles at the defenders. So we're really reaching the end game here. And Scipio and Hannibal's grandson, they're going back and forth negotiating. Hasdrubal is truly cut from his grandfather's cloth. He basically tells Scipio to pound sand. Carthage is never going to fall. And at one point, shortly before that naval battle, Scipio ordered a night assault, and his soldiers, a small group of them, actually penetrated the city for a brief amount of time. They were able to withdraw because the Carthaginians were gearing up for a counterattack, but Hannibal's grandson, Hasdrubal, he was really unnerved by how quickly his defenses fell apart when the Romans penetrated the city. And I think, to me, that details morale within Carthage itself was beginning to fall. It's been 2 years of a siege. We all went through 2 years of a pandemic. Imagine 2 years in an ancient siege where every single day you're on ice, not knowing if it's going to be the time the Romans finally break through. So Hasdrubal does what has been done throughout history, and he basically commits his entire population to the siege. So he makes it very clear. He takes all the Roman prisoners of war they've collected so far, and he tortures and kills them in front of the Roman army. And this basically tells the citizens of his city, hey guys, you're in this with us now. There's not going to be any peace here. We're fighting to fight. There's two options. We're either going to win and break this siege, or we're all going to die. Interesting proposition. And the Romans, of course, are infuriated watching this. So when the time does for the sack to take place, it is horrible for the civilian population, who is caught in between a true rock and a hard place. So Scipio at one point even offers to allow Hasdrubal to save himself and his family, and Hasdrubal refuses, saying Carthage will never get sacked. Fortunately for him, it does get sacked. And I actually don't think sack is a strong enough word. This is pretty much an engineered genocide of a civilization. That's how I like to think about it. Think about what that means, civilization. That's religion, that's language, that's arts, that's all the legends, the history, the technology. To put it into perspective, almost everything we have about Carthage is from either Rome or Greek manuscripts. Rome destroys everything there. And all we have left is through either that Rome-tinted bias or in fragments via Greek manuscripts. So this is a civilization that potentially could have sailed to the western coast of Africa 1,000 years earlier than Portugal did. This is a giant of the Mediterranean, and the only reason we don't have a whole lot on them is because, unlike the Greeks or the Macedonians or the Persians or the Egyptians or even the ancient Hebrew kingdoms, their entire civilization is a victim to a genocide. It's terrifying to think about. Imagine you're a United States citizen today, and you find out in 2,000 years that almost nothing about America has been preserved outside of fragments or information written down by the entity that destroyed the United States. It's awe-striking. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox. Ultimately, in 146 BC, after 3 years, Scipio throws everything at Carthage, and he breaches the walls. The Carthaginian defenses don't hold up that long. Civilians join in on the resistance, and you get the ancient equivalent of street-by-street fighting. It is brutal. It's horrifying to think about. It's truly an entire population of a city fighting Roman legionaries. You have civilians, throwing themselves off buildings with their families. You've got a lot of Roman deserters who join the Carthaginians fighting to the end. You have Carthaginians having last stands within temples. It's truly the end of days kind of stuff. And throughout the next week or so, the Roman army burns, kills, and slaughters everything in sight. Some pockets of Carthaginian soldiers exist, but ultimately they're just overwhelmed by the marauding Romans. The famous scene that survived to us is of Scipio looking over the city of Carthage being destroyed, essentially, and talking about how one day, this could be Rome, and he tears up. And that's all BS. I highly doubt it. And he ends up quoting Homer. My thing with ancient history, if anyone's super big into quoting ancient Homer, they're probably a sociopath or a psychopath. That's just me. The public relations game in ancient Rome was unique. But anyway, Rome kills everyone, and they finally, so generously, allow the Carthaginians to surrender themselves to slavery. Hasdrubal is taken in chains for Scipio's triumph, and Hasdrubal's family ends up throwing themselves on a pyre when they see him being taken into captivity. And remember, Rome, being Rome, is going to do Roman things. So Rome sends a delegation to ensure that everything in Carthage is properly demolished. Think about that. Rome has finally beaten its most terrifying boogeyman of its history, maybe until Attila the Hun. So Rome's going to destroy Carthage brick by brick, street by street, house by house, temple by temple, column by column, until nothing is left. The city ends up being reoccupied by the Roman Empire 150 years later, and it's a very important part of the Roman Empire, specifically towards the latter half, where a lot of the grain that supplies the Western Roman Empire is grown and exported through Africa. But the end of Carthage, the city itself, is essentially the end of the legacy of Phoenicia. And I haven't mentioned Phoenicia because they're an ancient civilization that occupied kind of modern-day Lebanon and maybe southern Syria. And they're known for their seafaring ways, very commerce-heavy. They had the first written alphabet in history. And we don't know a lot about them because the Phoenicians in Phoenicia, they're victim to a bunch of different invasions. Famously, Alexander the Great takes one of the Phoenician city-states. And Carthage is kind of the last beacon of that civilization. A civilization that deserves by every right to be viewed in the same way we view the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Mesopotamians, Greeks, Macedonians, even Romans. And we don't have a lot of them because they get wiped out. The last death throes of that civilization is wiped out with the sack of Carthage. So what happens next? The Romans have won the Third Punic War. Scipio gets his triumph. Hasdrubal is allowed actually to live in Italy the rest of his life. And the rest of history happens. Rome dominates the rest of the Mediterranean. And Rome really, to me, makes the world smaller. And it builds the skeleton known as Western civilization, which now dominates most of the world. And I've just told a very imperfect and overly simplified version of kind of the death throes of the Carthaginian existence. But my question now is, what if the opposite had happened? Carthage had the opportunity to possibly take Rome itself and do exactly what the Romans did to Carthage to Rome, specifically during the Second Punic War. Hannibal could have taken the city of Rome and laid waste to it. But what are the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and so on order effects from that? A true juggernaut like Rome's civilization being wiped out. Think about Rome's impact in the world today, specifically in the West. Christianity, all the Romance languages, a lot of our political inspirations and even aspirations derive from Rome. What if things were switched and everything ended up being derived from a Phoenician Carthaginian version of civilization instead of a Greco-Roman version? This question truly inspires me, and while I'm gonna continue to make the shorter form videos, which are kind of fun and on like super kind of niche subjects, the longer form stuff where I can kind of verbally like question things, that's what I really like enjoy doing. As a recovering historian, that's the whole point of history. It's trying to understand why things are the way that they are, right? So while I don't think I'll ever dive into subjects that have been, covered extensively, like the First or Second Punic Wars, I'll continue to cover the subjects that maybe aren't as well known on specific YouTube as a platform. And I never want to be one of those history channels that just throws statistics at you and, talks about tactics and whatnot. It's going to be very much of a kind of an open narrative of just me talking about things, trying to put really dumb humor into it and seeing what happens. Because, history is about us, human beings, dealing with the friction that is our existence. And I want to explore that with all of you and try to find and flow through narratives and ask questions about what all this means. So I won't be perfect. My sense of humor is often juvenile and misplaced. But if you did enjoy this video and you'd like to join me on the journey, please like and subscribe. And most importantly, thank you for supporting the arts.